The morning sun broke over Manhattan, flooding the skyline with a golden glow that turned glass towers into blazing mirrors. Down on Fifth Avenue, a black limousine slid silently through traffic like a predator moving through water. Inside, Richard, Caldwell leaned back in the leather seat, adjusting his cufflinks with the precision of a man who hated imperfection. He was in his late 40s, immaculately groomed, the kind of man who measured his worth not in heartbeats, but in billions. Richard was not just wealthy, he was power wrapped in skin. The world had labeled him a genius, a dealmaker, a king of mergers. But those who knew him closely, those who worked in his orbit, carried a different description: arrogant, ruthless, untouchable. He believed control wasn't an option. It was the only way to live. Every decision, every gesture, every deal had to bend to his will. Today was his masterpiece. A $3.5 billion agreement with international investors that would place Caldwell Global on the map as one of the most formidable empires in the modern world. For months, he had choreographed every detail, from the negotiations to the exact table where signatures would be exchanged. Even the choice of restaurant was deliberate. An exclusive 5-star establishment in New York City, where the walls whispered of power and the chandeliers reflected only the faces of the elite. To Richard, nothing could be left to chance. The limousine stopped in front of the restaurant, its polished exterior gleaming under the rising sun. Richard stepped out, his navy suit tailored so precisely it seemed woven onto his frame. The doorman greeted him with a nervous smile, but Richard barely noticed. He didn't see people, he saw positions, roles to play in the grand theater of his success. The maitre d' rushed to welcome him, guiding him through marble floors and crystal chandeliers toward a corner table set like a throne. Every detail screamed opulence. Crisp white linens, polished silver, glasses sparkling as though they had been carved from ice. The scent of roasted coffee and butter drifted faintly from the kitchen, mingling with the soft music of a pianist tucked into the corner. Conversations buzzed low, deliberate, as businessmen in sharp suits leaned in close, their voices thick with secrets and ambition. Richard paused for a moment, scanning the room like a general surveying his battlefield. This was his arena, and soon his triumph would echo beyond these walls. In just a few hours, his name would be etched into financial history with the ink of $3.5 billion. He imagined the headlines, the interviews, the applause of shareholders. It wasn't just a deal, it was legacy. Yet beneath the glittering stage, something darker hummed. The air was too still, the silence between piano notes stretched too long, the light catching the glasses just a little too sharply. There was a weight in the room, invisible but undeniable, like the pressure before a storm breaks. Richard didn't notice it. He was too consumed by his own reflection, his carefully rehearsed smile, the perfect angle of his tie, the dominance in his stride. He believed nothing could touch him, nothing could derail him. He believed the day already belonged to him. But the truth waited quietly, disguised in the folds of ordinary life. Not in boardrooms or contracts, but in a single fragile moment. A moment that would not just threaten his legacy, but tear it apart. And as Richard Caldwell sat down at the corner table, adjusting his cufflinks one last time, he had no idea that the storm was already gathering. The soft glow of the chandeliers reflected off the polished glass walls as another day of service began, and in the blur of designer suits and wealthy patrons, Maya Rivera moved with quiet determination. She was 24, dressed in a perfectly pressed crimson uniform that somehow felt heavier on her shoulders with every shift. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, and though her lips curved into polite smiles, her eyes told another story, one of exhaustion, resilience, and a fight no one else could see. Maya wasn't born into this world of crystal goblets and tailored power. She had clawed her way into it the only way she could, through work. Double shifts, endless steps across marble floors, and tips that rarely stretched far enough to cover rent, let alone the mountain of student loans looming over her. Yet she never let it show. Customers saw grace, a waitress who never faltered, never complained. What they didn't see was the quiet storm inside, her heart, Her mother's illness was another weight she carried. Chemotherapy appointments that drained more than just energy, hospital bills that stacked like walls around them. Maya had become both provider and protector, forcing herself to believe that if she just kept going, one tray, one table, one day, at a time, they would survive. This morning, her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the trays lined with steaming plates. Not from weakness, but from fatigue, the kind that lived deep in her bones. Still, she straightened her back, whispered to herself the same words she always did before stepping onto the floor. Dignity first. No matter what. The restaurant was already buzzing. Deals whispered over cappuccinos, laughter that wasn't real, eyes that measured worth by watches and cufflinks. To most of them, Maya was invisible. Just another uniform moving between tables. But invisibility had its power. People revealed themselves when they thought no one was watching. Maya noticed everything. The trembling hand of a young executive hiding nerves behind bravado. The sigh of a wife bored by her husband's business talk. The lonely glance of a man who had wealth but no warmth. And then there was Richard Caldwell. She noticed him the moment he walked in. How could she not? He carried himself like the world bent around him. His navy suit was immaculate. His shoes gleamed. His confidence so thick it seemed to part the air as he moved. He was seated at the corner table, surrounded by international investors, their sharp suits and hushed tones confirming what Maya overheard in whispers that morning, that today was a day of history for him. A deal worth billions. A legacy waiting to be sealed. Maya steadied her tray, breathing deeply. To her, he was just another guest. Billionaire or not, everyone deserved the same service, the same respect. She didn't know that in a matter of minutes her path would collide with his in a way neither of them could escape. The investors studied the menus with quiet precision, their expressions calm but unreadable. Richard spoke with grand gestures, his voice carrying across the room as though the deal was already his. To Maya, his tone felt sharp, like a blade honed too many times. She approached carefully, her movements deliberate, her focus on balancing the tray of steaming plates and crystal-clear water. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the chandelier, the piano, the glittering silverware. Everything in this room spoke of power. Everything except her. And yet in the silence that would follow, she would become the one thing no one could ignore. For now, she took a steadying breath and moved toward the table, unaware that fate was waiting to write her into the story. The clinking of fine china filled the air like a delicate soundtrack, blending with the soft, steady rhythm of the piano in the corner. Conversations swirled around the room, hushed yet weighted, like the low hum of power in motion. At the center of it all, Richard Caldwell leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence as if it were stitched into his suit. His words rolled across the table like commands, not suggestions. He wasn't just talking business, he was performing dominance. Across from him sat three of the most powerful men in the room, international investors flown in from Seoul, Singapore, and Dubai. They were men accustomed to wealth, yet cautious, disciplined, and deliberate. The kind of men who had learned to watch a person's smallest movements before they trusted billions to their hands. The eldest among them, Mr. Han, wore an expression as calm as still water, but his eyes missed nothing. He had seen empires rise and fall, and he knew arrogance was often the crack that split the strongest facade. Richard, however, saw none of that. He was too consumed by the idea that today was his coronation. He spoke about markets, expansions, and figures as though the deal were already sealed. His tone carried the weight of inevitability, and the investors listened quietly, their expressions polite masks. The table had been prepared like an altar, polished silverware aligned perfectly, glasses sparkling as though they were cut from diamonds, candles burning in tall crystal holders. This was the battlefield where power was tested, and Richard believed he had already won. But then, like a soft ripple cutting through a still pond, Maya approached. Her tray balanced with practiced grace, each step careful but steady. She kept her eyes down, her focus on the table, not the men seated at it. She had carried heavier loads than this tray, responsibility, fear, exhaustion. This was just another service. To the investors, she was part of the scene, almost invisible. To Richard, she was less than that. Just another server in a world designed to orbit him. But to fate, she was the match hovering over dry wood. She leaned in to set the first plate before him. For a moment, the candlelight caught her face, highlighting the quiet strength beneath her tired eyes. Her hand brushed the edge of Richard's sleeve, an accident so small it should have been forgotten in an instant. But Richard was not a man who forgave imperfections. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, his pride flared like a wound. The investors paused mid-thought, their gazes shifting, their silence sharpening. They noticed the change in him instantly, the storm gathering behind his polished smile. Maya, unaware of the weight about to fall, gently placed the rest of the dishes. Her movements careful, her dignity intact. The tray lowered with a whisper of sound, the glasses chiming faintly as they touched the table. The air shifted. The piano played on, but softer now, as though the keys themselves sensed something was about to break. Conversations around the room began to fade, voices trailing as curious eyes turned toward the table where power and pride were colliding. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, his lips pressing into a thin line. He hadn't spoken yet, but the silence itself was a warning. One careless moment was about to set fire to everything he thought untouchable. And as Maya stepped back with quiet grace, the storm broke loose. The piano in the corner played a soft, lilting tune, but even the music seemed to hesitate as Maya stepped back from the table. The air hung heavy, thick with a silence that pressed down on the room like an invisible weight. Richard Caldwell's eyes locked onto the young waitress, as if she had committed an unforgivable crime. His cufflink gleamed under the chandelier, light as he straightened his sleeve with deliberate precision, every movement sharp, calculated, meant to remind the room of who held the power here. Then, with a suddenness that cracked through the air like thunder, he slammed his palm against the table. The fine silver rattled, glasses shivered, and a knife toppled against a plate with a high-pitched chime. Heads turned instantly. Conversations froze mid-sentence. "Don't touch me, you stupid girl." The words cut louder than the piano, louder than the murmurs of wealth and power, louder than the heartbeat Maya felt pounding in her chest. They echoed across marble floors, climbed up crystal walls, and silenced a room that had only moments before been filled with polished laughter. Gasps rippled through the restaurant like a wave breaking against stone. A fork clattered from a distant table, its fall strangely loud in the thick hush that followed. The pianist's fingers hesitated on the keys, the melody faltering as if even music bowed to the brutality of those words. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she thought she might cry, the sting of humiliation burning behind her eyes. But years of practice, of enduring long shifts and dismissive customers, steadied her. Her lips pressed together, her chin lifted just slightly, and with the strength of someone who had known hardship far greater than insults, she said nothing. She did not defend herself. She did not plead. She placed the last glass down with quiet care as though nothing had happened and turned away. But silence can scream, and in that silence everyone heard what mattered most. The investors sat stiff, their expressions carved from stone. Mr. Hahn's gaze narrowed, his wrinkled hands folding slowly over his napkin. He exchanged a glance with the man beside him, subtle yet sharp, a silent verdict passing between them. They were men who had seen everything: wars, markets collapsing, empires rising, and they knew one truth that Richard Caldwell had just proven. Arrogance always reveals itself in the smallest moments. Richard, blinded by pride, smirked as if the matter were finished. He tugged his jacket into place, adjusted his tie, and leaned forward, picking up his speech right where he left off. To him, the interruption was a speck of dust brushed aside. But the room, the investors, the waitstaff, even the strangers seated at nearby tables, they no longer saw his numbers, his charts, his promises. They saw the crack in the empire, the rot behind the polish. Maya walked away with quiet grace, her back straight, her step steady. Yet the sight of her slipping through the hushed crowd left something behind. An imprint, a mirror. To those watching, it was no longer a waitress being insulted. It was a revelation of who Richard Caldwell truly was. The storm had broken. But Richard, so consumed by his own sense of control, didn't yet realize that in that single careless moment, he had lost the very thing he came here to win. The echo of Richard's words still clung to the air long after Maya disappeared toward the back of the restaurant. The piano had stopped playing altogether now, its silence almost accusatory. Every pair of eyes in the room seemed to burn into the corner table where the billionaire sat, smug and oblivious. Maya's absence was louder than her presence had been. She hadn't fought back, hadn't demanded an apology. Instead, she left the weight of her dignity behind like an invisible curtain draped over the room. And that silence, it was heavier than Richard's voice, heavier than the billions he was bragging about. The investors shifted in their seats, no longer leaning forward with interest, but leaning back with something colder, calculation. Mr. Hans' gaze lingered on Richard, not with admiration but with scrutiny. His mind wasn't on the profit margins being rattled off. His thoughts were on what he had just seen, a man who could destroy someone's spirit over nothing. Richard's voice droned on, full of numbers, percentages, expansion strategies. Our projections show a 42% growth across Asia. In the next 3 quarters, integration will double returns within 18 months. He gestured with his hand, wide and grand, as if he were painting the future with his words. But the future he imagined no longer existed. His audience wasn't with him anymore. The eldest investor slowly set his napkin down on the table. The motion was soft, deliberate, but it sliced through the room like a verdict being signed. Another followed, and then another. The quiet shift of fabric, the scrape of a chair leg across marble. It was enough to make Richard pause, his words catching in his throat for the first time that morning. Confusion clouded his face. Why were they moving? Why weren't they clapping at his brilliance, Mr. Han leaned slightly toward his companions, his voice low, but it carried the kind of weight that silences men in power. A man who cannot respect the people who serve him cannot be trusted with billions. The words landed like a gavel. They weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The truth of them seeped into every corner of the room. Those at nearby tables heard them, the waitstaff heard them, even the maitre d', who had been trying to disappear into the wallpaper, heard them. Richard's mouth twitched, a flicker of panic breaking through his polished mask, but he tried to smother it with another smirk. Gentlemen, he began, forcing a chuckle. Let's not get distracted by... But the investors were already done. Their minds were made up. They had seen enough. Across the room, Maya reemerged, holding an empty tray. Her eyes were dry, her expression calm, but the investors caught the strength in the way she carried herself. The quiet resilience in every step. They understood something Richard never would. That dignity in silence is more powerful than arrogance in noise. And as Maya passed their table, one of the investors gave her the smallest of nods, a gesture of respect, as if to say, "We saw you. We believe you." Richard, however, missed it. He was too busy trying to pull the threads of control back into his hands, not realizing that they had already slipped away. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here. Richard forced a laugh, the kind of hollow chuckle that bounced off the polished walls and died before it reached anyone's ears. He straightened his tie, leaned forward, and spoke louder, as though volume could patch what was already broken. Gentlemen, let's refocus. The numbers don't lie. Caldwell Global is positioned to dominate in the next decade. Our margins in Asia alone are projected to triple. With your capital, we will achieve what no competitor can even imagine. But no one leaned in. No one nodded. The investors' eyes were cool, detached, and unwavering. They didn't interrupt him, but their silence was heavier than words. Every boast that left his mouth only exposed how blind he was to what mattered. Richard mistook their quiet for consideration. In his arrogance, he believed they were still weighing figures, still calculating profit. He couldn't see that they were measuring him, not his spreadsheets, but his character. And he had already failed. Mr. Hahn rested his elbows lightly on the table, folding his hands. His expression remained calm, but his gaze sharpened. He was not watching the slides Richard's assistant nervously shuffled beside him. He was watching the memory of a waitress walking away with dignity. In Hahn's mind, the insult still echoed. He had led empires through storms, negotiated across continents, but one thing he had always trusted was that character outweighed contracts. A man who humiliated a stranger over nothing was not a man to anchor billions to. Meanwhile, Richard droned on. With vertical integration, supply chains will shorten, production costs will fall by 18%, and one of the younger investors shifted his chair back slightly, crossing his arms. His gaze was fixed not on Richard, but on the faint, red flush creeping up his neck. To him, the CEO looked less like a visionary and more like a man unraveling under his own ego. Across the room, whispers had begun. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring about what they'd witnessed. The story was already spreading, faster than any press release Richard could craft. Phones discreetly tilted, fingers tapping screens under the tablecloths. In the age of cameras and instant judgment, the narrative was no longer his to control. Yet, Richard still believed he owned the room. He gestured broadly, his watch catching the chandelier's light, his voice rising with each promise. "Gentlemen, this is not just a deal. It is history in the making. Together, we will change the world of finance forever." But the world had already changed, right there in a fleeting moment of cruelty before he even realized. Mr. Hahn glanced toward the door, subtle but clear. The others followed his eyes. The signal was quiet, but it was final. Their decision was made, and Richard didn't even see it. He smiled to himself, certain he had impressed them, certain he had secured his crown, but what he had really done was sign the death warrant of his empire with his own arrogance. And as the piano began to play again, soft and deliberate, it sounded less like music and more like a funeral march for the deal he thought was already his. The sound came first, a soft scrape of chair legs against marble. It wasn't loud, but in the tense silence that had gripped the room, it was thunder. Richard paused mid-sentence, blinking as one of the investors slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. The man placed his napkin neatly on the table, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Then another chair slid back. And another. Richard's chest tightened. This wasn't part of the script. He had prepared for questions, for negotiations, even for hard-nosed bargaining. But not for this. Not for silence turning into rejection right before his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile, "if there's a concern, let's address it directly. We're all here to make history together." His voice cracked slightly at the end, though he masked it with a cough. But the investors didn't sit back down. They didn't reach for contracts or pens. They didn't even glance at the glossy binders stacked neatly by his assistant. Their eyes were steady, their posture unyielding, their silence heavier than any words could be. Finally, Mr. Hahn, the eldest of them all, turned to Richard. His face was calm, but his voice carried through the restaurant with the precision of a scalpel. "If you cannot respect the people who serve you," he said, "how can we trust you with billions?" The words cut through the air like a verdict. Gasps rippled across the dining room. A spoon clattered onto porcelain from a nearby table. Even the pianist faltered mid-note, his fingers freezing over the keys. Richard's smirk collapsed into something jagged, a twisted mask of confusion and anger. This is absurd," he stammered. "A misunderstanding. She brushed against me and I—" Mr. Hahn raised a hand, silencing him with effortless authority. "You revealed yourself," he said simply. "We believe you." It was over. One by one, the investors turned and walked away. The scrape of their chairs, the measured sound of their footsteps, the rustle of their jackets. It was the sound of $3.5 billion leaving the room. Around them, other diners whispered furiously. Phones raised discreetly, eyes darting from Richard to the departing investors. In an age where every moment could be captured and shared, Richard's downfall was already being written in pixels and headlines. Richard stood frozen, his hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He wanted to shout, to command them back, to remind them who he was. But the truth was clear now. Who he was had already cost him everything. And as Maya reappeared at the far side of the room, carrying a tray with calm, steady hands, her eyes briefly met. Mr. Hands. He gave her the faintest nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of her dignity. She had said nothing. She had done nothing but stand tall in silence. Yet it was enough to unravel an empire. Richard Caldwell had walked into the restaurant expecting to secure his legacy. Instead, he had signed its death sentence with his own arrogance. And the world had just witnessed it happen. Richard stood alone at the corner table, his investors' chairs still askew, napkins folded neatly like tombstones left behind. The pianist resumed, but the music now felt like mockery, a slow requiem that echoed his humiliation. The room didn't look the same anymore. Faces weren't politely averting their eyes, they were staring. Staring with judgment, with curiosity, with the hunger for scandal that clings to power when it falters. Richard tried to steady his breath. He reached for his water glass, his hand trembling slightly, and forced himself to drink. Regain control, he told himself. You've salvaged worse. Money speaks louder than anything else. But then his phone vibrated on the table. Once. Twice. Then again, the alerts piling on until the screen lit up like a beacon. He ignored it at first, brushing it off as trivial. But the vibrations didn't stop. His assistant, pale-faced, picked up his own phone, eyes widening as he read. "Sir," the assistant whispered, his voice tight. "It's already online." Richard snatched his own device. There it was. Grainy video, shaky but unmistakable. His voice sharp and cruel, slicing through the quiet of the restaurant. "Don't touch me, you stupid girl." The clip was barely 15 seconds long, but it was enough. Enough to rip away the mask he'd spent a lifetime polishing. Headlines were already spinning. Billionaire Caldwell humiliates Waitress during 3.5B deal meeting. Investors walk out after CEO's outburst. Character costs. Caldwell global billions in minutes. His chest tightened as if the walls were closing in. He could see his empire unraveling right there on the glowing screen. The stock ticker at the bottom of a live feed was already flashing red. Caldwell Global shares dropping by the minute. Calls from board members flooded his phone, each one more urgent than the last. "Richard, what did you do?" One voice barked when he finally answered. "It's a misunderstanding," he began, his tone defensive, but the voice on the other end cut him off. "No. This is character, Richard. You don't fix this with numbers. You've destroyed trust." He hung up, his fingers tightening around the phone as though he could squeeze reality back into obedience. But control, the one thing he believed, he always owned, had slipped through his fingers like sand. Meanwhile, Maya worked silently at the far end of the room, collecting dishes, refilling glasses. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't wanted to become the center of attention, yet her dignity, her calm silence, had become the anchor of truth in a room drowning in arrogance. People whispered her name softly, servers offering her looks of quiet admiration. To them, she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a mirror reflecting the truth. By the time Richard stumbled out of the restaurant into the flashing sun of Fifth Avenue, the damage was irreversible. The $3.5 billion deal had collapsed before it was ever signed. His company's shares were plummeting. Reporters were already gathering, microphones flashing like weapons, their questions sharp as blades. And somewhere above the noise, the truth rang clearer than any number he had ever spoken. One careless insult had cost him everything. The restaurant had emptied into whispers, but the weight of what happened lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Maya kept her composure as she stacked plates in the kitchen, the clatter of porcelain against steel sinks echoing louder than her own thoughts. Her heart still carried the sting of humiliation, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't afford to Dignity was the only armor she had. Behind the polished doors of the restaurant's private lounge, the investors gathered. They spoke quietly, their voices low and deliberate, but the meaning was sharp. Mr. Hahn, still calm, folded his hands over the table and looked at the others. The deal was never about numbers, he said softly. It was about trust, and we saw today that Caldwell cannot be trusted. The others nodded. But then one of them, the younger investor from Singapore, spoke up. That waitress, he said. Did you see the way she carried herself? She didn't lash out. She didn't break. She held her dignity. Mr. Hahn's eyes softened, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. Strength like that deserves more than silence. By the time they left the restaurant, the decision was already made. The $3.5 billion deal would not belong to Caldwell Global, but something else would be set in motion. Something quieter but far more meaningful. The next morning, Maya's manager called her into the office. She braced herself for bad news, perhaps a reprimand, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, he handed her an envelope, his eyes wide with disbelief. They asked me to give you this, he stammered. From the investors. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter on heavy stationery, written with deliberate, graceful pen strokes. Dignity is the foundation of true strength. Your grace in the face of cruelty has not gone unnoticed. We are establishing a scholarship fund in your name to ensure you never have to choose between survival and your dreams. Additionally, all medical expenses for your mother will be covered under our foundation's care. You inspired us, and now we hope to give you the chance to inspire others. Maya's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears flooding her eyes. For years she had lived on the edge of exhaustion, working shifts until her body ached, sacrificing everything for her mother's treatments. Now, in one unexpected turn, hope had been placed back into her hands. Her manager cleared, his throat, his own voice thick. They said you earned this, not by asking but by simply being who you are. Maya clutched the letter against her chest, her heart beating wildly. She had walked into work that morning a waitress, invisible to most, unseen except when something went wrong. But now she carried proof that even the smallest act of dignity could ripple outward, shaking the world of billionaires and rewriting the fate of someone who had always believed she was powerless. And while Richard Caldwell's empire crumbled, in the headlines Maya discovered something he never would, that true wealth is not in money, but in how you rise when the world tries to push you down. Richard Caldwell's office once stood as a monument to power, floor-to-ceiling glass, a skyline at his feet, and the hum of staff who jumped at his every word. But in the days following the restaurant incident, that empire began to collapse, piece by piece, as though someone had pulled a single thread, and the entire fabric was unraveling. The news had spread faster than wildfire. Every business channel replayed the video in loops, his hand slamming the table, his voice sharp and cruel. Don't touch me, you stupid girl. Commentators dissected every second. Analysts debated whether character truly mattered more than profit. And social media branded him with hashtags that burned hotter than any press release his PR team could craft. His phone, once a lifeline of deals and opportunities, became a weapon against him. Every ring carried bad news. Partnerships suspended, endorsements withdrawn. A retailer that had signed on for a $400 million contract pulled out overnight, citing concerns about cultural alignment. His legal team warned that lawsuits could surface: hostile work environment, discrimination, shareholder betrayal. The board of Caldwell Global convened in an emergency video call. 12 faces glowed against Richard's giant screen, none of them sympathetic. You've destroyed trust, the chairman said bluntly. This isn't a PR problem, Richard. This is a leadership crisis. Shareholders are demanding answers. I can fix this, Richard snapped, his voice too sharp, too desperate. It was a misunderstanding. We'll spin it. No. The chairman's voice cut him down. Spin won't rebuild what you destroyed in 15 seconds. The investors didn't walk out on the deal. They walked out on you. For the first time in years, Richard felt a crack inside himself. Not anger, not indignation. Something colder, sharper. Fear. His assistant, who had once hung on his every word, barely met his eyes now. Staff who used to scatter like birds when he barked orders walked past his office door in silence. Even the marble lobby of Caldwell, Global, felt different, its grandeur hollow like a stage stripped of its actors. Meanwhile, the stock ticker bled red. Caldwell Global's valuation plunged, wiping billions from its market cap in hours. Headlines screamed, "From billionaire to liability, Caldwell's fall from grace." 3.5B deal collapses after CEO's public outburst. But perhaps the cruelest cut came not from markets or media, but from people. Ordinary people. Waiters, cleaners, janitors, drivers, workers who had been invisible to him his entire career, shared their own stories online. Some claimed he'd spoken to them the same way Maya had been treated. Others said they had left his company in silence, humiliated and unseen. The pattern was undeniable. His arrogance had finally built its own gallows, and now the rope tightened. Late, one evening as he sat alone in his office staring out at the city he once believed he ruled, Richard realized something terrifying. He was no longer in control. His billions, his power, his empire, it all meant nothing without trust. And that trust was gone. On the other side of the city, Maya tucked her mother into bed, the letter from the investors resting on the nightstand like a fragile promise of hope. While Richard's empire crumbled, her life was being rebuilt, quietly, steadily, with the bricks of compassion and dignity. The scales had tipped. The billionaire who thought himself untouchable had been brought low by his own pride, while the waitress he humiliated walked into a future brighter than she ever dared dream. Maya sat at the small wooden table in her modest apartment, the envelope from the investors resting open before her. She had read the letter so many times she nearly knew it by heart, yet each time her eyes fell upon the words, her chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "Your dignity is a strength the world needs. We will cover your education and your mother's care. Go and build the future you dream of." Her mother, resting on the couch by the window, looked better already. The foundation had moved swiftly. Appointments booked, specialists secured, medications delivered to their doorstep. For years, Maya had carried the quiet weight of fear, of wondering if the next paycheck would be enough to cover both rent and her mother's prescriptions. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The following week, she stepped into the campus of a prestigious university in Manhattan, not as a server delivering food to hurried students or professors, but as one of them, as a student herself. The scholarship had been written in her name, and as she walked across the courtyard with a fresh notebook in her arms, she felt something she hadn't in years: belonging. Yet Maya carried herself with the same quiet humility. She didn't boast about the opportunity or dwell on the night that had changed everything. Instead, she poured her energy into her classes. Literature, creative writing, storytelling, fields she had always loved but had never thought she could afford to pursue. Her professors noticed quickly. She wasn't just another student. She wrote with a depth of lived experience, with a voice that came from enduring, surviving, and still believing in grace. At home, her mother often asked her to read aloud from her essays. One night, after Maya finished a piece about resilience, her mother wiped away a tear and whispered, "You've always had this gift, Maya. Now the world will finally see it." Her story, though, was not just academic. The investors who had witnessed her humiliation in that restaurant kept their quiet promise. They checked in from time to time, never to interfere, but to ensure that her foundation remained solid. 1. Even arranged for her to intern at his cultural foundation during the summer, a position that paid well enough to allow her to focus entirely on her studies without the endless cycle of double shifts. Maya's life was changing in small but profound ways. The bruises of poverty began to fade. The constant ache of exhaustion slowly lifted. And while the memory of that night with Richard Caldwell lingered, it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like the turning point of her story. She often thought about the investor's words, "We believe you." That belief, offered without condition, had carried her into a world she once thought was locked away forever. And though she would never say it aloud, in the quiet of her heart, she knew one truth. What Richard had meant as an insult had become her greatest beginning. His cruelty had been the spark, but her dignity was the flame that carried her forward. Far across the city, Richard Caldwell's name appeared on news tickers in a different tone. Suspended by his board. Under review. Shareholders demand resignation. But Maya no longer followed his story with anger. She didn't need to. Life had already delivered its judgment. Her eyes were fixed on her own path now, one built not on arrogance or wealth, but on grace, courage, and the strength to rise when others tried to push her down. The city buzzed that evening with the kind of restless energy only New York could hold. Lights flickering against glass towers, taxis weaving through traffic, and newspapers on every corner bearing one headline: Caldwell forced out. The billionaire CEO who once commanded boardrooms had been ousted by his own company. His empire, once worth billions, had crumbled under the weight of a single moment that revealed his true character. Richard Caldwell walked out of his office for the last time, not through the grand lobby he used to stride across with confidence, but through the side entrance where no cameras waited. His suit was immaculate, but his face was hollow. The arrogance had drained from his eyes, replaced by something unfamiliar: defeat. For the first time in his life, he had no audience to impress, no deal to close, no empire to boast about. Meanwhile, in a quiet lecture hall uptown, Maya stood before a small group of fellow students reading an essay she had written for her creative writing class. Her voice trembled at first but steadied as she spoke about dignity, the kind that isn't loud or showy, but the kind that survives when the world tries to crush you. She wrote not about wealth or power, but about her mother's resilience, about nights spent working double shifts, and about how strength sometimes looks like silence in the face of cruelty. Her classmates listened, moved, and when she finished, the room filled with a gentle, genuine applause. Maya lowered her gaze, a small smile touching her lips. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was being seen for who she truly was. That night, fate brought their stories into quiet collision. Richard found himself wandering the streets, the world deafening around him, yet inside him, silence. He passed a bookstore and froze. In the window was a poster for a student writing showcase at the university. Maya Bennett, the featured speaker. He didn't step inside, didn't approach. He simply stood at the window, listening through the glass as her words carried out, faintly into the street. Respect cannot be bought, and dignity should never be stolen. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what truly matters. Her voice pierced through him. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It was calm, steady, true, and in that moment, Richard felt the weight of everything he had lost. Not the billions, not the empire, but the respect of others, and the respect he had never learned to give. Maya didn't see him standing there in the shadows. She didn't need to. Her life had already turned toward a brighter path, one built on the foundation of her own strength. Richard turned and walked away, the city swallowing him whole. For the first time, he understood that power without humility was nothing but a house of glass, waiting for the smallest stone. And for Maya, the lesson was different. She had been humiliated, dismissed, reduced to nothing by a man who believed himself untouchable. Yet in the end she rose, not because she shouted, but because she carried herself with a dignity no billionaire could ever steal. The story closed itself that night in the glow of the city lights. One empire crumbled, one life rebuilt, and a single truth written into the heart of everyone who heard it. Money may build walls, but respect builds legacies. And sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that refuses to bow to cruelty.